Welcome, everybody. My name is RP. I will be the moderator of today's event. I am representing Apex Lab. We are a software development agency who are heavily involved in the energy industry. The reason we created this community is to bring a more pragmatic approach to enhancing smart grid technology and obviously to bring energy professionals together. My guest today is Diya. She is the R&D data scientist at Digital Energy Solutions at CSEM, and she will be talking about CSEM's project dedicated to managing uncertainty in demand-side response. We will start with a short presentation from Diya, followed by a little bit of a free-flow discussion between the two of us, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. I encourage everybody to write down your questions in the Zoom chat as we go. You will have a chance to ask them directly at the end. So thank you very much for being here, Diya. The floor is yours. I'd be happy to see your presentation and hear a little bit more about the project itself.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you for organizing this event. I will quickly share my screen. So can you see the slides?
I can, yes.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here today to present CSEM's work on the management of uncertainty in demand-side flexibility. So to give you a bit of context very quickly, CSEM is a public-private, non-profit Swiss technology innovation center. We are active in various domains. That includes digital technologies such as digital health, Industry 4.0 or IoT, precision manufacturing like additive manufacturing or scientific instrumentation, and the coolest one, sustainable energy, which includes solar cells and modules, integrated and lightweight photovoltaics, batteries, and also digital energy, which is why we are here today. So the first question is, why is demand-side flexibility so important? With the increased electrification of heating and mobility, coupled with the high variability of renewable energy sources, grid reinforcement will be needed in order to ensure the grid security and accommodate all the demand. But we can also think of making the demand more flexible, meaning we adapt it so that it becomes more in line with the supply. And this would allow us to reduce this need for grid reinforcement and to avoid or delay those investments. And indeed, there is a clear potential in demand-side flexibility in different areas and different technologies. So on this graph, you have the projected demand-side flexibility for the EU in 2030. So what you can see here is in light blue, the possible production increase or consumption decrease, and in dark blue, the possible production decrease or consumption increase in terms of shifted energy for residential electric heating and electric mobility. And to give you a sense of scale, if you look at the residential electric heating in one direction, so it's about 200 terawatt hour, and that's 3 times the final electricity consumption of Switzerland in 2020. And so our goal is to be able to exploit this flexibility, this demand-side flexibility that has a potential that's clear, while preserving the end user's comfort, but also preserving the functionalities of the assets. The first step in exploiting the flexibility is to be able to quantify it. So what I mean by that is that if we have an asset and we know its baseline power across a time horizon, what we would like to know is what is the minimum and what is the maximum power that we can reach at any time step while respecting all the constraints of the assets, whether it's technical, so you can think of the maximum power that an asset can reach, or if it's related to the comfort of the user. For example, if we're controlling a heat pump, we would like the temperature in a house to remain within reasonable bounds for the user. And by knowing those two bounds that we cannot violate when exploiting the flexibility, we can correctly use it. But the challenge is how to manage the uncertainty in both consumption and production when estimating this flexibility. So the first question is, where does this uncertainty come from? It can come from the weather, so we can have uncertainty in forecasts, or we can have extreme events that are unpredictable, and this will highly impact the heating or cooling needs, but it can also impact the renewable energy production. We can have an incomplete system description. What that means is that, we can have outdated information, missing information, some unclear dependencies, or some assumption or constraints that are not clearly stated or explicitly stated. And we have, of course, the consumer behavior that generates a lot of uncertainty. There is always this element of randomness there. And a good example of the impact of the consumer behavior uncertainty is on electric vehicles. Because if we think of the management of EVs, we have a high uncertainty on the arrival or the departure of the electric vehicle from the charging station. And this makes the exploitation of their flexibility quite challenging. And so to deal with this uncertainty, CSEM has developed a unique data-driven solution to quantify the flexibility of different types of assets and activate those assets in response to specific requests or specific needs. So to give you an overview of our solution, given a pool of assets where we can have different types of assets, so stationary batteries, electric vehicles, a heat pump, our solution is essentially two pieces of software, the flexibility estimator and the dispatcher. And those two softwares, they communicate with the pool of assets currently via our servers. And to be able to do their tasks properly, what they need is historical data from the pool of assets regarding the power consumption of the assets or their state. And we need also some external forecasts. So for the weather, for sure. And also, depending on the application, we can have forecasts of the price of electricity or the CO2 emissions. And then all this data is used first for the flexibility estimation, where we want to find the bounds where we can deviate from the baseline power. And then this flexibility estimation is used for the dispatch. What the dispatch does is that it calculates the optimal flexibility request that will be then communicated to the pool of assets. So our solution is unique due to its many features. So first, it's uncertainty aware. This means that we quantify the uncertainty in our models, and this allows us to set after a risk level when estimating our flexibility. What this means is that we can control how robust or how conservative our solution will be. We implement data-driven methods. This means that we do not need to go in depth when modeling any assets. We do not need to model them individually or know the full physical model. And we can easily adapt to different control strategies, for example, self-consumption in a stationary battery. And our solution is scalable, so it can support large pool of assets, and it has been tested in simulation with 1,000 assets. So the first step of the solution is the flexibility estimation. What we want to do is quantify this flexibility over a time horizon. And to do that, we use flexibility envelopes. So those flexibility envelopes will give us the bounds that we don't want to violate when exploiting the flexibility of the asset, when controlling them. So to give you an example, here on the left, you have the flexibility estimation for a stationary battery in the next 24 hours with a 15-minute resolution. And what you can see here is the baseline power in black. Then we have the minimum power that's possible in gray and the maximum power possible in blue. And those bounds, they really encapsulate all the limits of the battery, all the constraints. So we're talking, those are the power limits so that you respect the SOC bounds that are put by the user or the operator, and also the minimum or maximum discharging powers. And to be able to build that flexibility envelope, we use virtual battery models. So what do I mean by virtual battery models? we have different types of assets: stationary batteries, heat pump that can be coupled with a storage, or electric vehicles. But for us, all these assets are represented as virtual batteries. This means that we want to model their state of charge that needs to remain between 0 and 1. And those are the bounds that we have to respect in order to not violate any constraints. So basically, this variable encapsulates all the constraints and the limits of the asset into a single variable and represents all the assets in a single manner. And then we want to quantify the uncertainty. We have different methods of doing that depending on the asset, but we can either propagate the uncertainty of the power model to the state of charge, or we can quantify the uncertainty of the model parameters themselves. So now that we have modeled the assets and we have the uncertainty on those assets, what we can do is set a risk level when estimating the flexibility envelope of the asset. So to give you an idea of the impact of this risk level on the feasibility of the requests, so how you can see it is it sets a lower bound to the probability of having a feasible request. So if you look at the parameter alpha, which is the risk, when you increase alpha, you allow lower probabilities of having feasible power requests, meaning you increase the risk of having unfeasible requests. And inversely, if you decrease alpha, so you're decreasing your risk, you are putting a higher bound to the probability of having a feasible request. This means that you reduce the risk of having unfeasible requests. So to show you the evolution or the impact of this risk on the feasibility of the request, what we tried to do, what we did, is we estimated for different power levels how long we can sustain a request. And so basically what you see on this graph is we have the actual possible duration of the request, and you have the predicted duration of the request. What you need to take away from this graph is that the black line is the optimal case, where we perfectly estimate the possible duration of the request, meaning we fully exploit the flexibility. Below the black line, you have the unfeasible domain, meaning we overestimated the flexibility available and we start having requests that are not feasible. And then above, you have the feasible domain, where you remain feasible, but you're underestimating your flexibility. This means you're not fully using it. And what we can see is that as we increase our risk level, we have more and more points that move toward the black line, towards the optimal point. So we're exploiting more of the flexibility. But if we keep increasing it, we also have more points that start falling into the unfeasible domain. So what that means is that this risk level really allows you to set the trade-off between the robustness and how conservative your solution is versus how much of the full flexibility potential you're exploiting. So this allows you to have more control over your system and more control over the behavior of your solution. And you can really decide, depending on your application, how you want it to react, how robust you want it to be. So the second part of the solution is the dispatch of the asset. So the dispatcher will use all the flexibility envelopes that we computed for the assets to solve an optimization problem under constraints. So we can set different objectives for the total pool, like self-consumption maximization, electricity cost minimization, CO2 emissions minimization, or power request tracking, where the service provider can set the power trajectory that they would like to follow, and then the dispatch will make sure to split the request as needed to respect that. And the constraints of the optimization problem are the flexibility envelopes, because as we said, those envelopes already encapsulate all the different constraints that need to be respected when using this flexibility. And what we get as an output is an asset scheduling that's optimal for the flexibility requests. What this means is that we can know what asset to activate, when, and at which power level. So now that I have shown you the solution, I can show you some of the different applications we did with it. So we first did an experimental validation of the deployment of the solution at the industrial park of Las Cabezas in Spain, within the European project NEON. And the goal was really to test this deployment and the different interfaces we have. And here you see an example of the state of charge modeling, where in light blue you have the baseline prediction for the state of charge, and then you have this confidence interval, and we see that the actual measured state of charge falls quite nicely within the predicted range. And this is then the model that is used for the flexibility estimation and the dispatch. Then we tested the scalability with an open source library called Energim. So Energim was developed at CSEM. It's a building simulation tool to test climate control and energy management strategies. It includes different types of buildings that can also be calibrated to a given site. It also has some standard metrics that can be used to easily compare different strategies. The models in Energim, they come from Modelica and Energy Plus. And so we have different types. We can have single family house, offices, apartments, mixed-use buildings. And those are the models that were used to validate the scalability of the solution. So it was tested successfully with 1,000 of those buildings. So, and finally, a good application I wanted to show you. So I think it summarizes quite well the solution is peak reduction in buildings. So we took buildings from Energim. Then we estimated their flexibility and did the dispatch with the goal of reducing the peaks. And what you can see here is a graph of the aggregated results. So what's interesting to see is that you have the dark line, that's the baseline prediction. You have the green, which is the activated flexibility. You have in yellow the actual consumption of the buildings, and you can really see that when there's no request, we follow quite nicely the baseline. And in case of the request, of course, depending on the risk level, we follow the possible feasible request in that case. And so that's a summary of the application of the solution. So to summarize the different points of our approach, so we have a unique data-driven solution to quantify the flexibility of different types of assets and then activate them to answer to requests. We use battery-like modeling for the flexibility estimation that allows us to quantify the uncertainty on the models and therefore to set a risk level. And this risk level decides actually the trade-off between the robustness and how conservative our solution is and how much or how optimistic we are with our flexibility estimation and how much of the flexibility we use. We also implement data-driven methods, and that allows us to efficiently model different assets without having to go into the individual physical models, and that contributes to the scalability of the solution. Then those flexibility estimations are used for the dispatch to generate an optimal asset scheduling for the flexibility requests. And this means which assets to activate, when to activate them, and how much to activate them. And finally, our solution was tested both experimentally on a real site for the deployment validation, and then in simulation to validate the different features. And so now what? We have a complete solution that can manage the flexibility of different assets and their uncertainty. And we have tested in real life and in simulation the different features and the deployment. we are now looking to expand that solution. So we see that the contracted demand response capacity will only increase until 2030 and probably after as well. And we are looking to be part of that change. So if you're part of a grid operator, an aggregator, an energy community, or an EV fleet manager, or an asset owner, or if you have any other ideas that you would like to discuss, please reach out so that we can unlock this flexibility together. So that was all from my side for the presentation. So thank you very much for listening.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Diya. It was a fairly exciting presentation, very insightful. Before we turn to questions from the audience, I have a couple on my own, and I think I would like to kind of start off with getting to know you a little bit better. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what is your background and how did you end up in the energy industry, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So it will sound a bit cheesy, but I wanted to end up in the energy industry since high school. So I knew I wanted to invest my time in something that will benefit society. I couldn't be a doctor because I'm too afraid of blood. So I decided to fight climate change and help the energy transition instead. I started with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering at EPFL in Switzerland. And then I specialized in energy during my master's. So then it was more a focus on industrial processes and their optimization. And then gradually I started implementing more and more data-driven methods into that field. So some of the nice projects I've had the opportunity to work on is a data-driven model for monitoring the resources consumption of a chocolate factory. So that was a fun project. There was a lot of free chocolate. And then I also participated in a flow optimization study in a waste plant that also produces electricity and is connected to a district heating network. And that was also a fun project, but didn't smell as nice. And then after this, I discovered the digital energy solutions team at CSEM. And I have been an R&D data scientist there for more than a year now. So some key topics I've worked on is the flexibility management of distributed energy resources. So within energy communities or for ancillary services. And also I've worked on anomaly detection on some assets and industrial processes and building simulation.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for sharing. I have to say, I'm glad you didn't become a doctor. Otherwise, you wouldn't be hearing your presentation. And also glad you didn't get stuck in the chocolate factory. So good to have you. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about the company CSEM as well. And what exactly do you guys do there? If you could elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, CSEM is a public-private company. It's non-profit and it's an innovation center. So the goal is to develop advanced technologies that will then be transferred to the industry. And really the goal is to support innovation in the industry. And CSEM has an interesting history because it was created in 1984 for the watchmaking industry, actually, to support Swiss companies in that. And since then, it has expanded to be active in many fields. It still keeps that strong link with the watchmaking industry until now. We have more than 550 employees across 6 sites in Switzerland. And we are active in precision manufacturing, digitalization, and sustainable energy. So to give you more information on the sustainable energy part, we have a big focus on solar cells and modules and really the full value chain. So we're talking materials, prototyping, even work on the manufacturing processes so that it can be brought to a larger scale. And then we have an increased focus on batteries and digital energy. So that came a bit later. For batteries, it's a focus on both the materials, but also on the battery management systems. And for the digital energy, I mean, we work on flexibility management, grid management and planning, anomaly detection, of course, forecasting and generating, and forecasting the consumption and the generation of well, different assets. So yeah, it's a quite a large field of activity.
Very broad indeed. If you could stop your screen sharing so I can see you in full screen as well. Great, thank you. And so I'd be curious to hear a little bit about the need or the idea for this specific solution. Where did it come from? What was kind of the main drive behind it?
Yeah, so this solution was started by some of my colleagues, and they really wanted two main aspects in there: the modularity of the solution and the robustness to uncertainty quantification. So they really wanted the solution to be flexible, because they wanted to be able to estimate the flexibility in a similar way that came from experience through their struggles in other projects, where it's not as scalable if it's not done like that. And then they wanted to be able to translate immediately this flexibility estimation in the dispatch algorithm without having to rewrite the constraints, rewrite the limits, and making it more complicated. And so really now you have two standalone parts that, I mean, if you have one of the parts, you can still use the other independently. And once you model the assets, everything is the same after that. And you don't have to adapt the optimization algorithm. You don't have different methods to estimate the flexibility. So that was really a point that they wanted to have. And the second really was to have control over how robust the solution was. So it was really to make it robust so they can decide how much uncertainty they would like, once they quantify the uncertainty, how much confidence they would like to give to this estimation.
Thank you very much for elaborating on that. Another thing I saw you mention in your slide that it has been tested with 1,000 assets. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? What kind of assets are we talking about exactly?
So the solution, the scalability was still tested in simulation with 1,000 assets, and it was using the building models from Energym. And the thing is, for us, the dispatch algorithm was the bottleneck, let's say. So that was the key point that needed to be tested and successfully. And it was solved for the next 24 hours with a 15-minute time step for 1,000 assets in about 10 seconds on a regular laptop. So for us, that was a success, and it really validated the scalability of the solution. On the other hand, with real assets, it was the stationary battery in Spain, and that was to test the deployment and the interfaces of the solution.
Awesome. One more question from my side, and I see there is a couple of questions popping up in the chat as well, so we'll get to that. I'd be curious to hear what is the future plan for the product exactly.
So now we have a complete framework, and all the features have been validated, and we know it can be deployed. So what we're really looking for now is to expand it further, either through testing and implementation on real assets, but also with the possibility of adding more features through collaborations, depending on the applications. So I'd say those are the two main points we would like to move forward with. So that's why I highly encourage you to reach out if you see any potential synergies, or you can contact us, and we're happy to chat with you about that.
Great. I really appreciate you taking the time And now, well, unfortunately, thanks to Zoom, we have a little bit of confusion regarding the names. But I do see David had a couple of questions. So David, feel free to ask them directly to Diya.
Yeah, this is Dave Parsons. Just checking on this. How does this actually help the customer keep his business going? What's the, plain talk? How does this help the customer that's using this your technique?
So it's a tool for a service provider or for an asset owner. So if you're an aggregator, you have many assets, you can use our flexibility estimation to be able to know what's your potential and be able to trade this flexibility where you need to. And then you can use the dispatcher to be able to send the request that will respect the flexibility you planned for. So that's one type of application. And then you can think of, if you have different assets, you know the flexibility that's available. You can, for example, use our dispatcher if you'd like to test a different approach, or so it depends what is already implemented.
When you talk about flexibility, you're talking about when it's opportune to shut down your factory effectively. So you're saying like at night or something like this, we're working around that, the actual business time?
So it's really, so this is focused more on residential assets at the moment.
Okay.
So we're talking about stationary batteries or heat pumps. So it's just, instead of just heating at any time, you can control it and adjust it so that you heat while providing another service while increasing your self-consumption. So that's more the application we are going for.
I see.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be necessarily a complete shutdown, or it's more modulation.
I see. Okay, well, thank you much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, this is going to be a bit difficult. So there is a little reaction button on the bottom of the screen. So whoever has a question, you can just click that, and then I'll ask you to ask your question, because it's a bit of a confusion with the names there. Well, David, other David, I guess.
Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I've been interested in this aspect of how you represent and articulate the flexibility of different classes of assets. So I'm really interested to see some more work in this area. I was interested in kind of how the translation works between the state of your virtual battery and how that is related to whatever the real state is of the real system. Kind of thinking along the lines of whether you could actually have have a kind of uniform representation of the flexibility characteristics of different classes of assets that could actually be transmitted between market participants. So if one participant could advertise their flexibility characteristics in according to a uniform set of parameters, and then make that flexibility available to another entity on a commercial basis.
So thank you very much for your question. So just if I understood correctly, your question, it was to see if it's possible to reuse that flexibility representation of the state in different cases.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Yes.
Okay, so I mean, the state, how it's defined, it's dependent on the asset, but you can reuse that definition in multiple cases. Of course, if it's not a very specific case, but I mean, a battery, it's easy, straightforward. But if you think of a heat pump, the state represents how close you are to hitting the temperature limits in an apartment, and so this, or in a house, and so this can be translated across different usage. So it can be reused for different assets. I don't know if that answers your questions, or if you need some further clarification?
I would be interested. I saw you mentioned a couple of publications about this work, so I might follow up in those and try to understand more about how the representation works.
Yeah, those papers are very interesting. It's from some colleagues of mine. I highly recommend them. Yeah, but that's, let's say you define the state for a heat pump according to temperature, but also you can have a state that's specifically defined from someone, like, how do I say it? It can be defined as you wish as well. Like maybe a participant would like to define the state differently. We can work with that as well. It is possible.
Okay, sounds very interesting. Are you able to put links to some of the publications in the chat function?
Yes, I can do that quickly.
Thank you very much.
In the meanwhile, if anybody asks a question, you can just raise your hand, and Diya is looking for the links. You can gather your thoughts as well.
So that's the main paper.
Well, actually, I think it's going to be easier. We do have a Slack channel for the community members, and we can share that there or on LinkedIn as well. Let's not take Diya's time with looking for the links. We'll share all those after the event. I am wondering if anybody has any questions that they want to clarify with Diya. Doesn't seem like it. Well, there is one from Gareth saying, do you think this is the future, or should we look to place all devices into frequency response?
So for this question, I would say it really depends on the asset. So if you think of a heat pump, and if you go into a service that needs to be very reactive, then it won't match as well. It won't work as well. I mean, of course, if you think of a stationary battery, that's easier. But I think those kind of solutions still have their place for specific assets, or a heat pump that you don't want to dynamically control very quickly, more like having a schedule with a limited amount of requests.
Thank you. I hope that answered the question. And there was another one. If there are any details you can share regarding the dispatcher itself.
So at the moment, we cannot share too many details about this, but we can tell you it's essentially a mixed integer linear program. Yeah, I mean, it uses those flexibility envelopes as the constraints directly. So we don't add any more constraints regarding the assets for that.
Great. Well, last chance for anyone to ask a question. I'll give it a few seconds, and if not,
I might clarify one thing. There is a paper
Sure.
On the dispatch that is under review and will soon be available. And then I would gladly share it on the LinkedIn channel.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, really appreciate you taking the time, Diya. It was a very insightful conversation, and we will be sharing all materials with the participants and the ones who couldn't make it. I would like to highlight that we are organizing monthly events within the Grid community. So I do encourage everybody to join the community either on LinkedIn or Meetup. And I will be happily inviting everybody to the Slack channel as well, where we are sharing some additional exclusive materials. And I think it was really nice. Thank you very much for taking the time, Diya, again, and for everybody who joined, and wish you a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you for organizing this, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.